So it is Holy Week, and there are a lot of words to describe Easter, right? And some of those are empowering, amazing, peaceful. But one of the words that I love the most that describes Easter is the word hope, right? And so the definition of hope is this. Hope is a feeling of expectation and desire for a certain thing. It's looking forward to something. It's believing that something is going to happen. And so this week of Easter is all about hope. The problem with hope is that when we look around our world, man, it is hard to believe in anything. It's hard to believe in hope. It's hard to believe that the person next to you is going to stay your friend, and it's hard to look and know that we can count on anything. When we look at the chaos right now in this room, some of your parents are going through a divorce. Right now in this room, some of you are going through a breakup with the person that you thought you would love forever. I get it, you're in 7th grade, but you thought it would last forever. And you're going through a breakup. Some of you have had to change friend groups completely this year because the friends that you thought would be your best friends for life have stopped talking to you. Some of you can't even think past tomorrow because you just feel like you're in darkness. When we look at the big picture of the world, we look at politics, we look at everything that happened in Nashville last week, we look at all of the things that happen around us, and we bring it home to our lives, and we bring it home to the things happening to us and those people close to us. It is hard to really believe that anyone is in control. It is hard to have hope that everything will work out. In my life, there have been multiple times where I have struggled to maintain hope. And some of them I've told you about. You know, the biggest ones had to do with my dad's stuff, right? Had to do with when I was 13 and 2 days after Christmas, my dad says, "I'm leaving." And I wondered what I had done to make my dad leave. And that was my adopted dad. And then when I was 18 and my biological dad had come back into the picture, and he's like, "It's my day I'm graduating." And my dad's like, "So this isn't working with us anymore." Calm down, Kason. "So this isn't working anymore." And again, I wondered, what was it that I had done? And I wondered what it would be like for me to be a dad when I didn't know anything about it. And then there was June 2012, and my wife, Kara, and I were sitting at a Chick-fil-A in Flower Mound, Texas, and we had been on this adoption list for about 3 years, and we just kept hoping month after month after month that we would get a baby. And the thing with my wife is that she's the youngest of two, and she wanted to be a mom since she was like 5. Like, there are things that people dream of. Like, she dreamed of being a mom. And in that Chick-fil-A, she looked at me and said, "Maybe God's plan isn't for us to have kids." And it was hard to hold out hope that God had a plan in the midst of that. But the week of Easter kind of contrasts with that hopelessness that we see around us. And it's a light in the middle of the darkness that kind of is present in the world right now. And so for us to truly be able to understand the story of Easter, last week we looked at it through kind of a theological underpinning, and we kind of looked at it through that theological lens of the shattered mirror and of all of the things that went with that, and being able to see ourselves as God sees us. But for us to really let the story of Easter sink in, we have to look at it through the lens of being up close and personal, and through the people that it happened to. And so to understand Easter, we have to go back even to the Old Testament. And so what happens is that God calls this guy named Abraham and says, "Hey, I want to use you to start a nation, and I want to use you to be able to change the world." And so he allows Abraham eventually to have a child, and then his child had children, and eventually they had this entire nation of people that were their descendants. And those people were put into, it went into Egypt to be protected from some larger nations, but eventually they ended up, Kason, you need water? Okay. And eventually they ended up needing to be protected from other nations. And the one that they moved into was Egypt, and they were put into slavery. And so they suffered for hundreds of years, and they felt like God had forgotten them, but he hadn't. And he brought Moses into the picture, and he said, hey, Moses, set my people free. And Moses is like, but I don't even know how to talk. And God's like, I don't care if you know how to talk. And Moses says, well, but I'm scared. And he said, I don't care if you're scared. And so he goes and he goes to Egypt, and he leads them out because God shows himself powerful. And so the people of Israel go to the promised land after wandering around in the desert for 40 years and then begin to establish history, and they're following God, but they would follow God and then they would run from God and then they would follow God and then they would run from God. That sounds like our lives. Like we're like, God, we want you in our lives, but we don't want you in our lives that much. God, we want to follow you and we want to get blessed by you, but we don't want to actually like have it cost us anything. And that was the people of Israel, and that's what they did. And eventually, they were taken into slavery again, and then they'd be set free, and then they were put in slavery again, and then they'd be set free. And so finally, they said, you know what, we've got to go all in on God. But what they did was they forgot that it was about relationship and not rules. And so they went back into the land that God had promised them, but it was all about dotting the I's and crossing the T's. And it wasn't about knowing God or following God. And so they went for hundreds of years and they didn't hear from God. And so it was at that point that Jesus entered the picture. It was at the point where the children of Israel, who were God's chosen people, that they believed that God was going to bless them. They believed that God was going to lead them. They believed that God was going to be there for them. It was those people that felt abandoned. And it was to those people that Jesus came on the scene. Jesus comes on the scene into a nation that was told, we are God's special people. We are going to be blessed by him. And they felt like God had abandoned them. They felt like they just couldn't hear God's voice. And I feel like that's a place where a lot of us live too. A lot of us, you know what, have come to church for our entire lives, or we've come to church for a long time, or we met God at camp, or we did whatever, and we come face to face with God and we want to have a relationship with him, but for some reason, our life isn't working the way that we want, and so we feel like we're abandoned. And so the children of Israel felt like they were abandoned because they were told that they were God's chosen people. The thing that they didn't realize was that God wanted to establish a kingdom through them, but he didn't want to establish a kingdom that was limited by borders. He wanted to establish a kingdom that crossed all borders, that crossed all races, that crossed all geography and social classes and everything. And it meant that it couldn't be a kingdom of this world. It meant that it had to be a kingdom that was broader than that. But the children of Israel didn't know that. The children of Israel thought that God was going to make them kings and queens and princes and princesses of the entire world. And so for them to be in slavery, they felt like God had abandoned them. And Jesus comes on the scene. And Jesus lives a pretty normal life. With the exception of one time he was 12 and he wandered into the temple where the smartest, elite religious leaders were. And Jesus is telling them how they should believe in all the things, right? Jesus at 12, I'm like, oh, that's pretty gutsy. It's a little 12-year-old walking in telling old men how they should believe. But outside of that, he has a pretty normal upbringing. But he always knew there was something different about him. And so when he's 30, he finally is like, I have to go do what God called me here to do. I have to go be who I came to earth to be. And so Jesus begins to preach, and he preaches this message of hope, and he preaches this message of love, and he preaches this message that says you are not forgotten. No matter what you think or how you feel, you matter. No matter how the world around you treats you, you matter. No matter your social class or what you look like, you matter to God. And he preached to them this message that said, God is not far away. God is right here, and he's about to establish his kingdom, and he wants you to be part of it. And that message is one that is continuing today. He says you are not here on accident. He says you are not here just because. That every one of you is here for a reason. That every one of you is here for a purpose. And it's what I tell you every week, whether you've been here one time or you've been here a million times, you're part of the family. That you have an important part of what we're doing and of who God's calling our ministry to be. You have an important role. Because God has put you exactly where you are for a reason. And that was the message that Jesus preached to these people that felt abandoned. And you know what happened? The spark within those people that said God is real, God does care, began to flame. And they began to follow Jesus. And they began to have hope again, that God had a plan. And he went so far as he called believers to follow him, and he walked down a beach with 4 specific guys who were fishing, and he said, follow me, and they left their nets, and they left their boats, and they left everything, and they followed him. Because they knew that God had a plan, because there was something different about Jesus. And as Jesus preached, more and more people were drawn to him. But as more and more people were drawn to his message of hope, his message of life, his message, his promise of being loved, and his promise of significance, his promise that they mattered. As people were drawn to him, the people that were in charge prior to Jesus coming on the scene didn't like that. Because the people who had established the religious institutions at that time began to be threatened. Because all they could promise was, hey, maybe someday when you die, things will be okay if you dot your I's and you cross your T's and you pay your taxes and you tell us how awesome we are. And they sold religion, but Jesus sold relationship. And those people, those religious leaders, they were beginning to get threatened because people were saying, I don't want hollow religion. I don't want to feel like I have to earn my way to God. I don't want to have to feel like I have to be perfect in order for God to care about me. And Jesus said, you don't. Because God cares so much about you that he meets you exactly where you are. And the religious leaders couldn't fight back. And so they began to stir up trouble. And Jesus' ministry grew, and the religious leaders lost power. Until finally, toward the end of Jesus' 3-year ministry, they're going to celebrate the Passover feast. And the Passover feast was celebrated to remember when God brought the children of Israel out of Egypt and saved them from slavery. And so Jesus and his followers are celebrating that. And he takes bread and he takes wine, and he said, no longer is this simply going to represent part of that feast. It's now going to represent something bigger, and it's going to be my sacrifice to be able to help you have a relationship with God. And they're having this moment where things are clear, and is very close to a camp moment where things become clear because they were having a moment with Jesus, a moment of focus, and the distractions were put aside. And in the midst of that, one of them gets up and he betrays Jesus. And Jesus knows that something big is coming, and so he goes to the Garden of Gethsemane and he asks his followers, his believers, the ones who were with him all the time, his entourage, to go and pray with him. And they're like, okay, Jesus, we'll pray with you. And Jesus says, all right, I'm going to go over here and pray. Please continue to pray. I need my friends with me. And they're like, oh, we got you, Jesus. And Jesus is praying, and it says he was praying so in such an intense way that he began to sweat blood. Let that sink in. How hard do you have to be praying to begin to sweat blood? And he walks back to his disciples because he's like, I'm struggling right now. And he finds out, you know what? They're his best friends, right? They followed him around for 3 years. They followed on every word that he said. And you know what? You would assume that they're like awake and they're like, Jesus, what can we do for you? But Jesus, in that moment where he needed them the most, walks back and he finds his friends sleeping. That's good friends, right? And he says, can't you just stay awake with me for a few moments? And he goes back and he begins to pray. And the thing was, as he's praying, Jesus can look out over the valley because he's praying up on a hill. And he can look at this valley because on the other side is Jerusalem. And he knows something's coming. And as he looks out over to Jerusalem, he sees the torches. He sees the torches walking out of the city. And he knows something is coming. The thing about Jesus is, in that moment, Jesus knew he was going to have to die. But Jesus could have walked away because they were miles away and he saw them coming to get him. And Jesus continues to pray. And he goes back and asks his friends to be awake, and sure enough, they're asleep again. And he looks from them to the torches approaching, and he said, it's time. And Jesus is arrested under charges that weren't true. He had people lie about him. He was arrested and taken before the religious leaders, and he was beat and he was whipped. And he was a bloody mess. The thing was, even Jesus had his hope tested. Jesus, the Son of God, was faced with, do I trust that God's plan is best? Or do I choose to run? If Jesus had to face those moments, then we have to know that we're going to face those moments. Now, here's the thing about a message like this, right? A message like this, for those of us who have gone through those moments of darkness, those moments where we don't know how tomorrow is going to go, we don't know how this is going to turn out, we don't know the end result. For those of us who have gone through those moments, this message is relevant because we can relate to that. But I'm going to tell you right now, if you haven't been in one of those places, then this message needs to be locked away in your brain. Because at some point when you're following Jesus, at some point in your life, you're going to face one of those moments where you're not going to know if it's going to be okay tomorrow. Where you're going to face a moment where you're going to be tempted to do something that's out of character. Whether that's to go get wasted, whether that's to go too far with your significant other, whether that's to harm yourself. So this is one of those messages that you lock away and know, just like Jesus, that you're going to face one of those moments. And the truth is, you're going to face multiple of those moments in your life. But Jesus is arrested and he's beat. And one of his best friends follows him, hoping that he would have a chance to help him. But instead, Peter is there and he hears Jesus being beaten. He hears the false accusations and he hears all the things. And instead of his best friend rushing in to save Jesus, he denies that he even knows him. He denies it once, and then he denies it twice, and then he denies it 3 times. And the amazing thing is, and this is crazy, and his 3rd time when he denied knowing Jesus at all, the rooster crows because morning was breaking, and it says that Jesus, in the midst of bleeding, in the midst of being chained, in the midst of all of that, makes eye contact with Peter in that moment. Can you imagine that? You stab your best friend in the back, and the moment where you stab your best friend in the back, they make eye contact with you. How do you feel in that moment? Pretty crappy. I mean, I would. And Peter runs off. And Jesus is taken from the religious leaders to the government officials. And he's beat even more and he's whipped even more. They said he was beat so badly that you could see lung tissue exposed from his back. It is ooh. Yeah. But that's how badly Jesus was beaten. But Jesus continued to take step after step and do the things that he needed to do because he knew that his heavenly Father, he knew that God had a plan. Jesus literally didn't know if there would be tomorrow, and he continued to take steps. He goes to the cross, and in John 19:30 it says this: "It is finished," Jesus said. Then he bowed his head and he gave up his spirit. This is one of those moments where if you have followed Jesus for 3 years, if you have listened to his preaching and you began to have hope and you began to believe that God had a plan for you and for your entire family, for the entire nation of Israel, that God had a plan for the world. At the moment where Jesus says it is finished and he leans over and he is dead, your hope is gone. And the problem is that you didn't have hope in the first place. You didn't have hope that things would be good. And then you gain a little bit of hope, and then it is swiped right out from under you. And in that moment, his followers scramble because there's word on the street that the officials aren't satisfied with just Jesus being killed. They want to kill all of his close followers. And that's Friday. And a day passes, and they are sitting in a room, hoping that no one makes a noise, hoping that no one finds them, scared to death. Their hope is gone. All of the things that they base their life on are gone. And then Sunday morning comes. And in John 20, it's verse 3, it says this: Peter and the other disciple started out for the tomb. It was the tomb where Jesus was laid. They started out for the tomb, and they were both running. And the thing is, they were running because some of the women that had followed Jesus were like, I'm tired of just sitting around. We've got to do the things that need to get done. And they went to make sure that the body was taken care of, and it was wrapped the way it needed to be wrapped, and all of the things. And when they showed up, Jesus' body was gone. And so they immediately went back to Jesus' followers and told them the body's gone. Peter and the other disciple started out for the tomb, and they were both running, but the other disciple outran Peter and reached the tomb first. He stooped and looked in and saw the linen wrappings lying there, but he didn't go in. Then Simon Peter arrived and went inside. He also noticed the linen wrappings were lying there. These were the wrappings that the body would have been wrapped in at that time. While the cloth that covered Jesus' head was folded up and lying apart from the other wrappings. Then the disciple who had reached the tomb first also went in, and he saw. Is that the end of 8? Ooh, okay. He went in, and he saw that the body was gone, and he believed. Something began to stir in them. It was that moment where everything was done, and then there's a spark. You've had those moments. You've had those moments where you're like, oh, maybe things are going to go right. But there's not quite enough to believe. What was that moment for them? The thing is, Jesus wasn't satisfied with just a spark. Jesus isn't satisfied with giving you a spark in your life to know that you can trust God, to know that even when things are dark, even when you don't think they're going to work out, that you can trust God. And so he gives us signs of hope. In John 20, verse 19, it says this: That Sunday evening, the disciples were meeting behind locked doors. They were still scared. There was that hope. Maybe things are going to work out. Maybe they're not going to work out. But they're still scared behind locked doors because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. Suddenly, Jesus was standing there among them. Peace be with you, he said. And as he spoke, he showed them the wounds in his hands and in his side. Can you imagine that, right? Like he's on a cross and he has these like railroad ties, these giant nails hammered into his wrists. His feet are put on top of each other and they're hammered through the bone, straight into the wood. Can you imagine the mess that would have made? And then to make sure that someone's dead on the cross, they would take a spear and they would jab it in the side. And that's what they said with Jesus was that happened and that blood and water spilled out. And so he had this giant wound in his side, and he had giant wounds on his arms and giant wounds on his feet. And he walks into them, and they're still there. But he shows them, and they were filled with joy when they saw the Lord. The thing about that is that's gross, right? You would think that like Jesus, like he's like holy, right? He's risen from the dead, right? And he's there. You would think that he would be able to be like, oh, I will heal my hand. And like do the like Jedi whatever trick over his hand and like heal it. That's not really a Jedi thing, but like in my mind it kind of is, right? And so you would think that. But he needed to give them a sign of hope. He needed them to know and have something visual to remember whenever they were faced with trouble, when they were faced with hopelessness, when they were faced with darkness. He wanted to give them signs of hope to remember. It's so crazy that some of the most traumatic things in my life rotate around my relationships with my dads. But in those moments, man, I didn't know if I even wanted to be a dad, right? In that moment where Kara said, I guess we won't be parents, there was a darkness there. And a hopelessness there, and a mistrust for God to say, God, what are you doing? Can we trust you with the things that matter most to us? So 10 years ago today, an amazing thing happened. You can put that picture up. This is a picture of 10 years ago today. This is my son Isaiah on what we call his gotcha day. Hold on. Yeah, all right, you can choose. Ten years ago today is the day that he officially and forever became my son. God said, do you trust me? God said, do you trust me? He said to the disciples, do you trust me? So what is Easter about? Easter's about a lot of things. But Easter is about not losing hope no matter what darkness you face. No matter what you're going through or what you will go through, you need to know that God will always come through. That's a dangerous thing to say. But God will always come through, even if it's different than what we expect. Easter is saying God's there even when you don't feel it. The empty tomb is saying God's working even when you don't see it. That picture of my son kissing Winnie the Pooh, that's a weird thing to say. Kissing Winnie the Pooh is a sign that says God is working no matter what you think or how you feel. So this week I have 3 challenges for you. Bring hope to someone tomorrow. A word from you, a kind gesture, you doing anything that shows that someone matters to you that you wouldn't normally do can bring hope. Bring hope to someone tomorrow. Second, invite someone to come with you to Easter. The truth is, 80% of people, when asked, hey, if you were invited by a person to come to church, would you come? 80% said yes. A lot of times we convince ourselves that people don't want to go to church, but 80% of people say that if you ask them, that they'll come. Invite somebody to come to Easter with you, because Sunday will be all about people far from God being drawn to him and knowing that he loves them. And then finally, bring someone to connect with you next week. Guys, we're doing small group bonding next week. you know in your school that there are people that feel disconnected from everyone. You know there are the kids in the back of the room who sit there and eat bugs or pick their nose or that weird thing that you know you hate, that nobody's friends with. Terrence is like, maybe I'm that kid. I don't know. But we all know that kid. And we know that that kid feels abandoned because nobody wants to be around them, maybe for good reason. But invite someone to come with you next week because, like I said, whether you've been here one time or you've been here a million times, you're part of the family. And you are here for a reason, and you are a significant part of what God's doing. I love you guys. I pray for you every day. I'm going to pray, and then you're dismissed to small groups. Heavenly Father, thank you for today. Thank you for loving us. Help us to hold on to those signs of hope. Help us to cling to the truth that you will always come through in those moments where we want to give up. Help us to realize that you have placed us where we are for a reason, and that is to change the world with your love. Heavenly Father, I love you, and it is in Jesus' name. Amen.